Is it on?
We ready?
Hi, everybody. Good evening.
Good evening.
Can we please give a round of applause for Brittney again, whose book has been doing amazing things. So while we're here to talk about Eloquent Rage, we should also note that Brittney has published 2 books in the span of the last several months, one of which just won a pretty major award. The other book, Beyond Respectability, is an academic book, but the fact that she's teaching full-time, mentoring students, out here in the world, giving of herself, traveling, writing an academic text, and this new text that we have before us here says so much about her commitment to the people. And we're just grateful that you're here. I know you've had a long week, but it's good to see you, and we're celebrating you tonight.
Thank you, Dee. I appreciate you. And thank everybody for coming. I appreciate it.
Part of what we thought we would do, we picked out 3 sort of passages from each other's works.
From each other's books. Yay. Your book is coming. So Dee is being modest. So let me begin being his hype man. So No Ashes in the Fire comes out on May the 29th. So please get it. I'm going to give y'all some sneak peeks in just a little bit. But this book is dope. It's a game changer. And Dee is such a gift. I'm really thankful to be writing and working and living in your time. And I feel like this book is going to help a whole lot of people get free. There are a whole lot of folks who are waiting on this book. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a beautiful thing to be doing this with friends and family. And it's a beautiful time to be doing this work together. So speaking of family, I want to start by reading a passage from Brittney's book. She doesn't know what passage I'm going to read. This one, though, centers her grandmother.
Oh, God. Oh, my.
And then I'll follow with a question after. This is from a chapter called Grown Women Theology. The summer before I left home for graduate school, I drove down the rural Louisiana countryside to sit on the porch with my grandma. As I took the first steps up to the house, face scowling at the hot Louisiana sun beating down on my brow, my gram squinted at me, called me by my nickname, and declared, "It's time for you to start having sex." I'm sure my eyes bugged out of my head as the horror dawned upon me that this wasn't going to be an old, regular visit to the country. There was an accusation in her words, as though this was something my 22-year-old self should have been doing doing forever. For the record, I had, in fact, had a bit of sex by age 22. For my 22nd birthday, my homegirl, horrified at my post-college near virginal status, took me to a sex shop and purchased a vibrator for me. There was a classic black woman read in my grandmother's word, an unspoken, "If that's true, I can't tell." Of course, she couldn't. I was steeped in all kinds of Christian guilt about the little bit of sex that I had had and a copious amount of vibrating I had done. That, coupled with the asshole I had chosen for a first partner, meant that I wasn't having particularly joyful or enthusiastic sex, and most times I was in sanctified denial about my desire to be sexual in the first place. I'm going to skip down some. Comically, she explained to me, she's talking about her grandma, that I should have sex, but only if my partner was willing to wear one of those combos.
Combos.
What the hell is a combo? I wondered. Condoms? Her colorful descriptions and gestures made it clear that she meant condoms. Grandmama had not been able to hear well since her teen years, when some kind of fever damaged her ears. So when someone said condom, she heard combos. And skipping a little more. Perhaps it's time for us to read some other sacred text alongside the Bible. My grandmother's words are a sacred text to me, a sacred text of country black girlhood. My mother's words are a sacred text to me, a sacred text of grown black womanhood, the words of Sojourner Truth and Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston and Audre Lorde and Patricia Hill Collins and Anna Julia Cooper and Beyonce. and my homegirls are all sacred texts to me. And I want to start there by asking you to talk about these sacred texts. You particularly ground not just your understanding of Black feminism in a sort of genealogy of intellectuals, but Black Southern women. Your grandmama and your mama, who are your people? And how did they come to shape your understanding of Black feminism? How did they shape your writing of this book?
Thank you, Dee. You went right for it. Goodness.
I mean, just Crunk Feminist Collective.
I mean, you're
crunk.
right. I'm not shy. I just like to pretend sometimes. Okay. So, yeah, part of who my people are the women who raised me and the homegirls who hold me down. But they are also all of the ancestors and scholars who showed up when I got to the academy, particularly to a graduate program where I had all my Black nationalist sensibilities intact. I was all about combating white supremacy. And at the right moment, Black feminist professors showed up and said, but what about women, girl? What about challenging patriarchy? And that wasn't language that I had. And so all of those women, my grandmother, my mother, my friends, but also the Patricia Hill Collins of the world, the Audre Lordes, the Bell Hooks, all of those folks gave me the kinds of words, the kind of frameworks that would save my life. And I think part of the way that I came to understand them as sacred is, my grandmother blew my mind that day. She really did. It was, and she blew my mind because for many reasons. One, you never want to have that conversation with your grandmother, because in the course of it, she talked to me about her own sex life, and I had no desire to know anything about that. But I also realized that part of what she was doing, she had that conversation with me the summer before I started my PhD program. And she had always said to me, girl, reading all them books gonna run you crazy. Now, the other thing she would say was, girl, get your lesson, baby, get your lesson. But the balance to that was everything that you need for your life cannot be found in books. And that was a really hard truth, because for me, those books felt like freedom. School felt like freedom. I was trying to be the first in my family to graduate from college, trying to overcome generational poverty and all of that. And so I looked at school, achievement, and getting A's as a certain kind of freedom. And it took me a really long time, even after that moment. What I'd say in the rest of the chapter is that, my grandmother had told me that day, and I was just like thinking to myself, I'm trying to live holy. I'm a good a Christian. I'm a good evangelical. And the devil will just use anybody to get you off track, even your grandma. But I was not trying to hear the lady. I was not trying to hear her at all. It took me a really long time to realize that what she was saying was, none of the stuff that you have struggled for or that you want matters if you don't have a full life, if you don't have joy, if you are not invested in coming home to something, if you're not invested in your own bodily pleasure. And so in that way, my grandmother freed me up. And the thing that really helped was I thought about her as a Christian church lady, and I was in the process, I was using theology. Theology was a shackle for me. And it was a shackle in part because you hear your whole life, particularly if you grew up in the Deep South in the church, baby, just put God first and you can do anything, right? And so I did that. I committed to it like I committed to getting A's. And part of what then happened is I was so bent on following what I felt were God's rules that even when those rules began to stifle my own happiness, I didn't have any tools to sort of reimagine. And so when I got more sense, largely after having spent a lot of time learning about Black feminism, it helped me to reimagine what I was allowing to shape and inform my theology. And it made me realize that my grandmother knew something, that she lived 80 good years, 80 hard years, 80 years where she had to work for everything she got, but she also found good and joy in her life. And I realized that that was a win, and that that's what I want to be able to say at the end of my life. And so all of a sudden I had to listen to her and realize that maybe she was trying to tell me that there are some things that you come to know about God, spirit, and what is sacred by the choice to live your life, not by trying to follow a lot of rules. And so she helped me with that. And I think Black feminism helps me with that, because what the rules tell us, right, is that the rules say, the black folks rules say, we're trying to fight for freedom so that black folks can be in heteronormative relationships, so that men can head families. That is what the freedom visions that we got handed to us often say. And black feminism comes along and disrupts it and says, well, what happens if women lead? What happens if queer folks lead? What happens if your goal in life isn't to get married, live in the suburbs, have, a 2-car garage and a dog and a couple kids? What happens if you have a different vision of what it means to be happy? And so my grandmother said, look, this middle class thing you're striving for, baby, that's not all there is to have. That's not the only version of a life to want. And it really resonated with the idea that, black feminism says the same thing. Baby, that's not the only thing to have. That's not the only kind of life to want. So, yeah.
Come through. Y'all can snap and do all that stuff. I mean, her book is called Eloquent Rage. This is kind of like Black Church, so y'all can clap and all that type of shit too. Patriarchy.
Oh my. Okay.
This is from a chapter called The Smartest Man I Never Knew.
Why y'all being scandalous? Amen corner over here.
Lest I be mistaken though, black men didn't invent patriarchy. Patriarchy is America's daddy issue. America rules the world through war, the same way patriarchs rule families with an iron fist and a Janus-faced promise of either violence or benevolence, depending on which day you catch them and how well you bow down and do their bidding. Our government does not wage war abroad. It wages war in black communities at home, controlling black folks through surveillance and violence, demanding their submission and compliance. When submission and compliance is not freely offered, the state murders black men, women, and children, citing the rule of law. The war on drugs is not the most obvious example of a war that the US government declared and waged on black communities. That particular war and the ways it targeted black men and destroyed black families often rendered black women the spoils of war. And we have been treated as such, as trophies for men to tote around as evidence of their power and greatness. White men who waged war paraded narratives of black women before the American public in the 1980s, calling them welfare queens and crack addicts, and using hatred of black women to curry favor with the American public. Black men, demoralized by wars both at home and abroad, took possession of the one thing that was left, the women, treating us as their own kind of trophies, pretty objects that bolstered their social capital while commanding or compelling no responsibility from them, for, and to us. Say a bit about how you come to reckon with patriarchy, and particularly as it relates to black men, like your father, and those father figures in your life.
Yeah, thank you. How
does it feel hearing your words read back to you, by the way?
Really weird.
Okay.
It's really weird, but yeah, I mean, I guess I'm thankful that I made it through this book, because hearing particularly from that chapter, that's the daddy chapter. Everyone is like, we all, everybody got daddy issues. I certainly have them. And it was a really hard chapter to write. So The Smartest Man I Never Knew is my father. I knew my father. But part of what I try to reckon with in this chapter is the father that I knew versus the father that my community knew, because these things did not match. And so my dad, I knew him to be a violent alcoholic who showed up on the weekends and harassed and terrorized and beat my mother, and disrupted our lives. And then, as I got older, my dad got killed violently when I was 9, trying to protect his girlfriend from another man with a gun. And those become the hard truths that you tell, that for me, he was a monster. For his girlfriend and her children, he was a hero. Patriarchy kills black men too. And trying to sit in the tension of that is a thing that I'm reckoning with in that chapter. And and I found it, here was my goal though. So much of what happens when we talk about black feminist politics is that young women really struggle with being black feminist, in part because they feel like it becomes an indictment and pathologizing of black men. And as someone who is deeply committed to the freedom of all black people, I don't want to have a politics that makes black men into monsters, even though the one who was supposed to love me best was very much a monster to me. And so this chapter is me trying to write through how to humanize my dad, how to understand him with a level of empathy that, so like my dad passed away, but I lived in a small town, and so my community knew him. And so over the course of my life, people would tell me stories about my dad, about how he was deeply empathetic and one of the smartest men that they had ever met. And I was like, this fool that used to call and harass and like come through and just destroy shit and make life miserable. But this is the way that people talked about him. Well, I mean, just like 5 years ago, my stepfather didn't know my dad, but he met a man who did. And he was like, he said that your dad was the smartest man he ever met. And I don't know how to reconcile that with the man who came one night and slashed all the tires on my mom's car, right? What do you do when genius and brilliance exist in the same body with so much destruction? And so I tried to think in that chapter about where did the men in my life get the narratives that they had about how to be men. And so the thing that I want to do a lot in this book and that I try to do, I don't actually want Black people to go away. I want Black people to stop blaming ourselves for every terrible thing we struggle with. And I want that for Black men as much as I want it for Black women. And so so the thing is, I realized but if you live in America, American scripts are scripts of toxic masculinity. All of our military might is the most masculinist narrative we have. It's just going around swinging our dicks at the world, as like a gun, right? And then I thought about the fact that most of the men in my life, my grandfather who I didn't know, my dad, my uncles, other men, they went into the military because it was the one pathway that they had into the middle class. And so you can't go into the military, fight wars, or be war adjacent, and then come home and all of a sudden have a different script around masculinity. And so I realized that was the enduring script, was that these men, that the choices they made to try to actually be men with some level of respectability were some of the same places that they learned terrible forms of toxicity that made them a danger and a threat to Black women. And so I wanted to hold the complexity of that, try to hold that I had these tender moments with my dad, but also hold that so much of the trauma that I have around men now, so much of the trauma that I have in general, he is the cause of it. And so how do you hold people accountable for the harm that they do? And at the same time say, but he was just a regular person. And my dad died when he was 33. He didn't have the time to grow. And when I got to be 33, I was like, shit, that was young. How young that was, right? And so, yeah, I try to hold it because I think that that's the problem with so much of our revolution. We talk a lot in this moment about harm and trauma, and we need to talk about it more because Black folks haven't had a lot of space to hold their trauma forthrightly. But then when we talk about it, we don't always have scripts for how do you not throw people away? And what I hope is that if my dad were living, what I would have figured out is how not to throw him away. Because when I was a kid, I did, and I talk about, at 8, I was like, dude, I don't love you. You're terrible. I'm clear about who you are and what you are to me. And I said those things to him, right? And I hope that if he were here, that I would be able to hold him a bit differently. Because what I hope is that the empathy that I discovered that he had, what I hope is that if he had lived, he would have had, that empathy would have led him to the capacity to be more and do more. And so, can we use the deaths that happen to us, that destroy us, that devastate us, as the opportunity to imagine something different? I don't know who my dad would have been, but the freedom in that is maybe that I can imagine that the story would have been different. And maybe that becomes an invitation for the folks who are still living to make the story different, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was a hard question, Dick.
How you?
Give me an easy question.
Okay. How you feeling? Checking in with you. How you doing? Okay. Thank you. This one is just a short. That you. One of the things that I loved about this book, beyond it's just honest. It's sermonic. But you offer something that I haven't seen much of, and that is a grounding principle for how you understand Black feminism. And that is this. When I heard Beyonce articulate friendships with Black women as the core of what feminism was for her. It felt to me like she got the core essence of what this is all about. I love being a woman, and being a friend to other women should be feminism's tagline. Friendship, not only as a way of life, as some of y'all would come, but this idea that friendship and connection to your sister is at the heart of how you understand Black feminism was just so critical, at least for me. Say a bit about that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So look, I'm a Black feminist academic, and I think we have all of this language in this moment. Intersectionality, ways to think about structural oppression, sort of ever proliferating categories where we're trying to see each other and hold each other in our fullness. I feel like we have more sophisticated language, but we're not treating each other any better necessarily. And a lot of my connection to D is that we have done a good amount of movement work together. And one of the things you learn when you actually are in activist spaces is that sometimes it's the interpersonal dynamics that rip shit apart. It's not actually real debates over politics. It's all the other stuff that people have, that you just act like you ain't got no sense and you're unloving, and you act like you don't belong to anybody and stuff, and and then you show me you treat people crazy. And so for me, I was like, well, what is this actually all about? And so look, I know that feminists have lots of feelings about Beyonce. I've gotten lots of questions about this again. And look, it's not that I don't have an academic critique of Beyonce. I mean, I'm an academic. I apparently have to have a critique. So I have one. But what I see is when I look at her, so my Black feminist grounding principle one is that I start from the proposition that Black women are human beings, not icons, not brands, they may be other things, but they're human. And so I just kept asking myself, well, why would Beyonce choose feminism? Because people were like, oh, it's a gimmick. And I was like, because is feminism out here getting people cool points now? Like where? When did it happen? And let me find out, because I ought to be the coolest chick in the game if feminism is getting people cool points. Like, why would she take this on? I mean, this is weird. She didn't need to. Like, we were perfectly fine with our girl power anthems from Beyonce, and we didn't ever need her to take this on. So I always felt that there was some other thing that was happening there. And I love that even as she was dipping her toe into feminism, the very first thing she said when asked, this was the first interview, this wasn't 2013, it was 2010, she said, I love being a woman and being a friend to other women. So I'm a feminist in a way, because if that's what feminism means, then yes, I'm that. And I thought, right, that's the core of this. What does the quality of your relationships with women look like in your life? And that's true for any person, not just women. That is also my gauge for men. That is my gauge for everybody. What is your relationship to women? And we can expand to say your relationship to women and femmes. What does your relationship to women and femmes look like in your life, right? Because that'll tell me something about your capacity, your commitment. So look, I don't ever need you to say a feminist thing. I don't ever need you to quote me any bell hooks, any Patricia Collins. But if you tell me that you got real, true homegirls who hold you down, who you can call, who you can check in with, then typically you're a person I can trust. And so the thing that I've been trying to think about is that, and also thinking about it because I became a feminist in part because I was running around talking about how I wasn't a feminist, I was a womanist, feminist was white women shit, all the shit that we say. And I just had a homegirl who was like, girl, you're talking real crazy. Here's this book. Read it. That's how I became a feminist. I haven't always been this girl. That's the thing I'm trying to tell y'all. And so I realized over the course of my life that I had homegirls intervene with me and be like, B, Like, in the way that Black girls do, right? Eloquent Rage is a tribute to, the title is a tribute to a student who snatched my coattails and said, I see your rage and I appreciate it, when I was denying that I was angry in the first place. And so the book, there are all these moments when Black women have confrontations with me about the way that I'm living my life raggedy, but I think I'm right. And so much of how we are moving in politics right now is that everybody thinks they're right, and half the time people are raggedy. Yeah. And what we haven't figured out is, what is it? Do you have people in your life who are unimpressed with you enough that they'll tell you the truth? Come on. Right? And so that, for me, that's what it was, that I wanted to get back to a core thing. We can do all of this other stuff, and I'm happy to do that and train students to do it. But if you ask me what is the quality, like what I love to do with my spare time, one of the things I'm most proud of is that I have real, deep, true, quality friendships with Black girls that will throw down in the streets for me, and I will cut you and slice you and dice you and ruin your life if you mess with my friends. I mean that. I'm not being rhetorical. Because, look, at 37, with all these degrees and shit, and in the structural conditions we live in, it doesn't always work out real traditionally for Black girls like me. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. The partner just don't always show up. The sort of suburban fantasy doesn't always show up. But on my best days, my girls cheer for me, buy me flowers. On the first day of my book tour, I came back to the hotel room. My girls had conspired to get some chocolate-covered strawberries in my room, waiting on me. You know what I mean? That is love, and everybody should have that. And I think that the core of our politics should be rooted in that. And if we learned how to be loving with each other, some of the things that we wanted to get to in terms of freedom, we could get there a little bit quicker, because it would allow us to deal with each other with a little bit of ease. Well, let's think about it this way. How do you talk to the people that you love about things that matter? And if we thought about that as our principle when we were in movement spaces, that care and that concern, and the way that you're not trying to rip people apart or tear them apart to be right, then I think that we would do better. So, and I saw Beyonce doing that, and I felt like everybody was mad at her, and I was like, well, don't y'all hear what she's saying, and don't y'all see how you're proving her right, And so look, a lot of the people's resistance to feminism is the same reason that people don't like church. It's like, you don't want to go to church because church people are some of the worst people out here in the world. Like, they're just terrible people very often. And you also sometimes don't want to be in feminism because sometimes the most mean girls who say the most terrible stuff to you are the main ones who are like, but fuck the patriarchy. It's like, yeah, but can you be nice though to somebody? Like, let's just begin with basics. Are you nice sometimes to somebody? That's important. Yeah.
Amen.
Yes, that's it. That's it. All right. So I got some questions for D. Now I'm trying to see if I should read the scandalous parts of this book.
No.
Because I feel like you try to put me on blast. I'm not gonna do you the way that you did me, D. I'm not gonna do you that way. Hold on, let me get my phone. See, I'm modeling my feminist principles right here. Okay, here we go.
Friends.
This is my brother. All right. So, I love so many stories in this book, but this is one I wanna read. One evening after dinner, my father called me into the bathroom. As I walked closer, I could hear the water hitting the bathtub floor with force. The door was slightly ajar as he stood in the tub lathering a washcloth with ivory soap. "Open the door, what you standing there for?" he asked. I walked into the bathroom with as much annoyance as I did whenever I needed to wash. "I'm about to teach you how to wash yourself properly. You can't be walking around here stinking. You're getting older and your body is changing," he said, and he prepared the wash rag and soap as if we were about to begin a legitimate class on proper cleanliness. I stepped cautiously into the steamy bath water. It was the first time I stood in the presence of my father when he was naked, which actually made me forget about how much I hated washing. It was mystifying to stand in the bathtub bare before the man who often veiled his deepest emotions and used the force of his physical power to dominate the spaces he moved through. I stared at him as he stood uncovered, more vulnerable and more self-possessed than I had ever seen him. He was 23 years old at the time, younger than I am now, but he was a father who was raising children. I can barely care for myself at 41, employed and relatively well paid, and cannot imagine all the tools he needed and lacked to properly care for my siblings and me. "Get all the way in the water. Stop being scared. You gotta learn to clean your whole body, especially behind your ears and under your balls," he instructed me firmly but with care and amusement as we squeezed our bodies into the tub. When we sat down, he moved his hand over mine. Together we grabbed the soapy washcloth and moved it across my neck, behind my ears, along my arms, and across my chest. My father gently washed my back as he instructed me on how best to clean the parts that smell the worst when boys play outside all day. My fear of the bath dissipated more and more after each repetition of calm instruction offered amid safety in the presence of my father, who in other instances used the same hands to do damage. There was a lesson to be learned in the water. Bathing correctly was one lesson, but I also learned how tenderness and violence, care and harm are strange bedfellows. Yeah. So dealing with your dad, who was a complicated man, with that level of care and tenderness, say something to us about the necessity of dealing in that manner, holding both the complexity but also the easier, softer parts.
Yep. It's so we were talking in the back and we were saying how our experiences are so similar. My father passed while I was writing the book. And he died early. He was 55. He had me at 15. So for a big part of my life, I had, like you, a very complicated and myopic view of who he was. Had I wrote this book and finished it before he died, it would have been a different book. On his deathbed, I think I came to grips with the fact, it finally hit me. Like, I was like, oh my God, he had me at 15. Like, I just never thought about that before. 15 years old. When I was 15, I was in 9th grade. And it just dawned upon me, how the hell was he supposed to know how to raise kids and not be a man, but be a human being in the world when he was himself a kid? So this story was a way for me to reckon with the complexity of his humanity. Like you, I remember going to my mom and I said, so what do you think? Aren't you mad at him?
Right.
Like, don't you hate this man? And she said, he saved my life. Now it's interesting because he spent most of what I got to see from my vantage point was a man who was ruining her life. Right. He was really physically violent and nearly tried to kill her. But she never referenced that first. She referenced after he passed the time that he literally saved someone from trying to rape her in her backyard. And that struck me that if my mom, who was the recipient of the violence, could somehow see his humanity, then how the hell could I not? Yeah. But more importantly, I started thinking about my own complexity. Yeah. You know, I remember when he was literally on his hospital bed, and my sisters and I surrounded him, and I said to him, and at the end of that chapter, I include these words, I felt like he was hanging on, literally in that sort of hospital bed, carrying the weight of heaviness that I think so many black men might carry, from the structural issues that we have to face, the sort of heaviness that comes with the guilt, sometimes when we're absent in the lives of the people that we love and absent for ourselves. And I said to him, I know you're heavy. And I want you to let it go. Let it all go and fly. And he passed. And that was a redeeming moment for me. So when I was thinking, what if I not only render his hands as instruments of violence, but also remember that his hands were used to do the sweetest things, like wash his boy when he himself was a boy. And that's one of the moments in the book that I love the most, and I hope it honors him and does right by offering a more complex, nuanced version of him and black manhood.
Yeah. That's hard, dude. Wow. Oh my goodness. And mostly I want to thank you for the we were talking about the aftermath of writing books like this, and it's real hard. I'm gonna just say it like that. It's hard. It's not, it's not the mechanics that, that's not the hard part. It's you gotta go wade into all your stuff. And most of us have a bunch of stuff. And what we're not doing is unpacking it, all the time. And
in public.
That's right. Who can do that? So I want to read this funny part, because you talked about your dad being 15 and then who you were at 15. So let's see a little bit of who you were at 14. I was already wary of white teachers. Unlike the trust I had for Ms. Harrison, my black 6th grade teacher who used every subject hour as an opportunity to teach us black history, or Miss Dunham, the black music teacher who took me home some weekends so I could sing as she played the piano, I did not trust white teachers enough to think they would support me. So I combed through the yellow pages in search of a school close in name to Morristown Friends School, the school Miss Leary raved about. The first one I found was Mullica Hill Friends School. Is that right? Hi, my name is Diane Moore. My son is interested in your school and would like to apply. My voice at 14 was still shrill. Over the phone, I played the role of a concerned and loving 30-year-old mother. Fueled by determination and my dreams, I contrived a story, and to my surprise, it worked. A few days later, an application package appeared in our mailbox. Pictures of a field that was as lush as the grass on episodes of Little House on the Prairie TV show, positioned opposite a few old brick buildings, caught my attention. The campus looked more modest than I had imagined, but I knew white families with money sent their kids to the school whether they were capable of achievement or not. The anticipation I felt as I read over the application was matched only by the joy I knew I would experience when I got to tell Miss Leary I had been accepted to a friend's school without her help. I completed the application by myself, including the requisite parent's essay. Miss Leary insisted I couldn't write, but I guess she was wrong. I can't recall what I wrote exactly, but I was invited to interview. I just needed to figure out a way to get there. I called the New Jersey Transit Customer Service Hotline, gave a representative the address to the school, and asked for the best route. The trip would be an hour and a half. I traveled alone. Walking from the bus stop to the campus, I noticed that the houses seemed to expand the closer I got, and the kids, mostly white and seemingly happy, were not Miss Leary or Miss Campo white. They seemed like the type of white people who stayed far away from the streets I traveled to get there. So I'm gonna skip a little bit. Darnell got into this school. Darnell got into the school.
I did.
And ended up attending, you say. And so talk to us a little bit about your first striking out for freedom.
Oh,
what does it look like for black boys to strike out for freedom? And where do you feel like you got the moxie or the wherewithal to do that, because you were struggling with so much else?
I don't know. It's so funny. Hearing that actually read out loud is actually kind of funny. But that's the same year that I won a citywide poetry contest in Camden. And Sonia Sanchez was actually the person that had offered us the award. So I don't remember what I wrote then either, but I know it was some black shit. It was like the blackest poem a 14-year-old boy could write. And Sonia Sanchez cussed. That was like the first time I heard an adult like cuss, like in a school. Yeah. And I was like, oh yeah, this is it right here. But I applied to that school after that event. And it was mostly my wanting to prove to this white teacher who stood up in front of my class and said out loud, "You can't write." She said that in front of everybody. And I was like, I'm gonna show her ass, I'm gonna show her ass. And yes. I applied to this school, and I traveled by myself. I got up at 4:30 in the morning, and traveled on 2 public transportation buses, had to get to the suburbs to get to my aunt's house to get a school bus that then took me to the school. And my mom didn't know what school I was going to. And she was like, how you gonna pay for this? But my grandfather paid. But it was something about scarcity and opposition somehow, for some people, can be motivations for us to dream, big ass dreams. Yeah. It was when the cupboards were least full, when my mama could create the most magical meals. And I use that as a metaphor to say about sort of my life at that moment was such that it was a lot of violence happening. The school system, I knew it was horrible. And that gave me the sort of energy to want to seek out something different. And it's like I kind of dreamt myself into that circumstance. But I was also surrounded with community. It was those black teachers. Miss Harrison taught us African history, y'all, in math class.
Yes.
I don't know shit. That's why I'm bad at math now, because I'm like, she was doing black. I was like, can I get a trigonometry or something?
You're talking about.
But it was those folk that really gave me a sort of a sense that within me was magic.
Yeah.
That I was in possession of self-determination. And I didn't have those words, but I knew I had the wherewithal to go after the shit that I knew I deserved, despite what this white teacher was saying to me. And I don't know. It was and I wanted to make my mama proud.
Yeah.
And she was proud, but she was worried because she was like, I don't know how this bill getting paid, but we're going to make it pop.
That's right. Yeah. No, and it's just important for us to always be reminded of the kind of stuff black kids have to do to make it. So this is my last. I have so many ones, but okay, I'm going to pick this one. All right. Billy was just my third or fourth secret.
Oh, Lord. Okay, go ahead.
Later, I'm going to ask about Billy. I want to know all the stuff, all the secrets. Always in the dark of the night and always alone, I found touch and sometimes violence. Not that time, however. I searched and left the park with an answered prayer. It was a peculiar blessing, not unlike Terrence's innocent kiss or Jason's hugs that fueled my wet dreams every night. Those encounters were so memorable because they represented the fantastic, surreal power of fugitive freedom. Queerness is magic for those brave enough to make use of it, but it can feel poisonous for those who have yet to give in to its power. I sensed Billy's magic. So I traveled with Billy to his home in Northwest Philly. No overnight bag or change of clothes, no toothbrush or condoms, no clue how I would get home, and no contact with friends for several days. No cares in the world, including for myself. No money, no sense of Billy's last name. But we held each other every night. For that short time when we lost ourselves in our sweat, stale breath, and questions, there was no abandonment or fear of rejection. In Billy's cluttered 10 by 12 foot room, our bodies intertwined. We shared secrets we would later forget. We giggled at horrible jokes. In his wisdom, Billy encouraged me to push through college. We held hands, listened to music. Only the faint concerns of acquiring HIV after days of unprotected sex broke our harmony. But even the thought was not enough of a warning to convince me to leave or get condoms. How could I? The presence of arms and hands and tender lips and empathic hugs and loving thrust and seeing eyes was too irresistible for me to fear death. I had buried my fear of HIV years before when my Aunt Cookie told me at the age of 15 that a second cousin I had never met was gay. She didn't actually use the word. She made a hand motion others use when they wanted to communicate that someone they knew was a fag. And for the fag, risked like any dream of his desires for acceptable intimacy seemed to always be broken. Aunt Cookie quickly added, "Your cousin's name was Darnell too. He died of AIDS." Her semantics game worked. I would never again say AIDS and gay without interpreting them as synonyms. My fate was sealed. I was gay, and therefore AIDS would be my fate, just like my dead gay HIV-positive cousin, whom I had never met, who may have only existed in Aunt Cookie's imagination. But I kept my cousin alive in my dreams. I imagined that his skin was smooth and as brown as maple. His eyes were deep and dark. His hands were strong, but smooth enough to be held by the hands of another man. His back was perfectly postured, strong enough to carry his lover from the sofa to the bedroom. He was the black man I learned to openly shame and secretly admire. Yes, he did. This is, I mean, the prose itself is absolutely gorgeous in this book. You know, Dee, I'm struck by the toughness of a young black gay man coming of age, trying to find his way, and the way that even in the midst of struggling with it, that there was these sort of really intentional choices that you made that suggested that you were going to figure this out, that you drifted toward care, towards touch, toward real intimacy, that you, even when a family member in some ways deployed this cousin against you, that you use the power of your own imagination to imagine a different set of possibilities for him, to fill out those outlines in a way that were deeply human. And it strikes me that this is some of the compass that you draw for young folks in this book. You point them to the right things to look for, even if they don't have it all figured out. And you keep on reminding us of the power of imagination, even when you haven't gotten to the material thing that you need yet. Is that intentional? Say something about that?
That was whatever she just said. That's what I was trying to do, all that she just said. Okay. Thank you, Brittney. Let me write that shit down. I'm gonna use it at the next book. Can you write that down?
You ain't got good sense.
I'm like, I tried to deploy the power of but just to reference that moment, I was writing that because in so many ways I was trying to use that narrative to challenge the public health industry, to think about its the way it relates to we don't even call black boys and men anymore. It's called MSMs, we're now abbreviation and shit. Men who have sex with men. And so often what's responded to are consequences of actions, right? We're responded to as subjects. And in the line that says, like, we're subjects who report, not humans who feel.
Yeah.
No one is ever asking the questions that are lurking behind the actions. What is it that would move a 17-year-old or a 19-year-old to go to a park at 12 o'clock at night, where violence is there as a potential, to seek arms to be held by? What was it that moved me to walk to 13th Street, to stand on a corner where folk were selling that sex workers were, simply because I really wanted somebody to see me, to look me in the eyes and to say, I see you, you exist. It wasn't that, I like sex, but it wasn't just my like for sex. It was my need for connection in a space that was denying me that possibility. So I often wonder, would it have been changed if a doctor ever said to me, not, have you had sex with men if you were born after 1975, whatever the date is, but what is it that you desire? What is it that you need? Do you feel loved? Do you experience lovelessness? Why is it that you decide to not use a condom? Is it because you possibly feel like this is a thing that you are determined to get anyway because that's what you've been taught? For me, I would go, I'm telling you, up into this, I grew up in the sort of epoch of AIDS and HIV. It's still to this point, I have survivor's guilt. I will get a test and still sit there and go, what, I don't have it? Because I've been programmed to believe that that was the only alternative for me. So part of what I want to ask then is, if that is what you understand to be your lot, that is the sort of prophetic end, the thing that you're supposed to have, it makes sense why you would be in a park not using protection.
Sure.
And what I wanted to offer young people, particularly the 16-year-old me that I imagine writing this book to, is that sort of empathic view, a sort of empathic understanding of what love and lovelessness, and even an understanding of what lovelessness looks like, what it means to like grow up in a world where no one ever asks you who it is you like. Think about that, the mundane nature of asking someone who they have a crush on. The silence is around that. Think about what it means to grow up in a catered to school, never ever opening a book and seeing the possibility of same-sex relationships, ever. And that chapter is an attempt at me trying to unpack that. I want a 16-year-old who need this to pick that up and say, somebody understands. Yeah. And maybe they won't go to 13th Street at 3 o'clock in the morning in search of someone, a stranger, who can let them in a car just so they can say, I see you.
Yeah. We need this book. Thank you, Dee. So we want to talk to y'all. What y'all want to say?
Raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you.
Hello, thank you. This question is for both of you. Do you, it's for both of you as Black authors, but Brittney, based on how I heard your response about your relationship with your father, I guess you might want to think about answering it first because you inspired it. Do you indict white supremacy and its beneficiaries with the same vehemence when almost always this chemical weapon is responsible for creating the monstrosities we face in our homes and our communities?
Yes. So I have no fucks left for white supremacy. I don't play nice with white supremacy. But here's the thing. I want us to be able to have a conversation about what do the structures look like when we take them home, when we have to build actual relationships and community with each other. And the thing that I'm very much interested in is what does white supremacy rob from us? So white supremacy and patriarchy. I'm actually not my one bit of academic analysis here is that I'm actually really bothered by the way that we're trying to recast all of the gender stuff in Black communities as a function of white supremacy. Patriarchy is a real issue. Patriarchy is a system that's older than white supremacy. It's a system that would persist even if white supremacy didn't exist. And the thing that we keep on doing is saying that we got all of this toxicity only from white supremacy. So look, throughout the book, I rail against all of the ways that I think that white fear, that white structures of power have robbed Black folks of possibility, of power, and of the ability to flourish. But this is a decidedly Black feminist text, and so that means I have to reckon. So it means that I have to reckon with the way that I think white girls are racist, and they disrupt my own ease around feminism, and they disrupt the ease that so many women of color have around feminism. But there's this narrative in this moment, particularly that I see with young women, where it's like, we're so mad about racism that, you know, it becomes a railing against Becky at all times for the inability to get her feminist politics right because of white supremacy. And the thing that I'm saying is, yeah, that's part of the story, but when I think about the folks who have done harm, and white women have certainly done harm to me in my life, real actual harm, but when I think about the folks who devastated my life, and when I think about the traumas that keep me up at night and that I have to go to therapy for, it's shit Black men did. And so how can I hold the truth of that and still be loving and say, I don't think Black men are pathological, but I think that white supremacy has real effects. I think patriarchy, and look, and I think the aspiration that Black men have to want patriarchy is a problem. And so I want to hold the truth of all those things. But yes, I also think a lot in this book about the way that white people's fears get treated as facts, and the way that Black people's fears get treated as feelings, right? So for white people, you know, I've been saying, white people's feelings get treated as facts, and Black people's facts get treated as merely feelings, right? And that's a function of white supremacy. It's a function of a white supremacist knowledge system that says, well, where's your evidence that all the terrible things that you say are happening is happening? Where for white people, it's like, well, we feel like such and such is suspicious, therefore he is suspicious, and the cops are just gonna come over to the Starbucks and snatch you on out of the place, right? That's feelings being elevated to the level of fact. And then when Black folks try to say, look, this continues to happen, well, how do you know? Prove it. Or is this really happening everywhere? Is it just an isolated incident? That's the facts that we know for sure being diminished to the level of a feeling, delusion, and things we can't trust. And so I want to say that, but I didn't want to write a book that was railing against white supremacy. I wanted to write a book that said, okay, Black girls, all this shit that people say is wrong with you, because of how you're coping with and responding to white supremacy, you have the right to own it. You have the right to own your anger, your rage, your hurt, your pain, but also you have the right to have joy. And so yes, I think that white supremacy harmed the men in my life. I think it robbed them of good models for ways to flourish and be men. But I also fundamentally believe in the power of Black people to get to the freedom that we seek. And I think we can't do that unless we can have a different conversation about our hurts and our pains. So that's the thing I'm trying to do. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to address the question, or should I?
Okay. That was perfect.
Super.
Right there.
It's pretty incredible.
Hi, it's funny. Sometimes I've learned that the people we organize with say they want like the equity and the justice, but are really only after their own form of supremacy. And it just was something that was on my mind after what you said. But the question I have for you, for both of you, is because you sort of approach talking about class in your work, but it's not something that I hear like consistently. And I'll share, after a series of traumatic experiences, largely in faith-based settings and in my home, I became the first person in my family to get a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. You are the reason I'm applying to PhD programs this year, because there are not enough of us. And so one of the things that struck me after getting my master's degree, I was sitting down with my grandmother, and she didn't understand for the life of me why I would leave a job just because I wasn't happy there, right? Like she's not of that generation, right? And so a strange thing happened after that conversation, and in its subsequent conversations and visits with my grandmother, she began to use her white people voice on me. And it was the biggest taking aback. It was another way that I was othered in my family. And it's also another thing that I can't go back to, And so what I wanted to ask you guys too about, do you have some of that experience? Because there's a divide I see among Black people, even in our own families, a class divide. I stopped being a member of the family in another way when I pursued my education. And how do you deal with that and know that you work in the service of your people who may not necessarily accept you because of your credentials?
I don't know. I just have a really my family. They don't do that type of shit to me. But part of the way I think I'll respond to your question is, so class. Yes, I think it's present in both. Class analyses are present in both of the book. That we're both writing with a sort of sense of how class operates, but also class in relationship to geography, where we're living. You're in the South. I'm in an urban space in the Northeast. But what I wanted to say in response is that I was interested in analyzing and having a sort of self-reflexive analysis. That is, analyzing my own understandings around class and also in relationship to my family. So part of and in relationship to my community. In the last chapter, I try to wrestle with my own complexities, what it means to be within a community, having access to certain, just having access, period, having access to certain peoples, having access to certain amount of power, and how that had me read or interpret the actions of, say, organizers in the spaces that I was working in. And I tried to be very honest, not about, I think, the way that they were interpreting me as somebody who came with a sort of certain array of privileges, but I was trying to interrogate myself. So throughout the book, I think I struggle to do that. Yeah, we have a bunch of class issues that I can attest to that I've experienced in my own life, but I was really interested in how I shore some of that shit up myself, and how my interpretation of my people has often been shaped by my class positionality. And not just class, and we can be more specific. The amount of money you make, the amount of degrees you had, and how we sort of use those as a lens for whose word gets accepted as word, who we think have analyses, who we think get it. And that was what I was really interested in. Because what I discovered in my writing is that a lot of the ways that I've read people in my community and my family has so much to do with a lot of that shit I had the unlearning to do. Sometimes we have to unlearn the ways that the academy and the ways that a neoliberal society will tell us that the getting of those things puts us in position to analyze somebody, and as if they're not analyzing us already. Sometimes that speaking back is a critique, and I want to hear that sometimes.
Yeah. Let me add. So when I got my PhD, I had a graduation party. My auntie was sitting in the room just staring at me, just staring. And I was like, why are you looking at me like that? And she was like, I'm just trying to see if you done changed.
That's it.
Right?
Yeah.
And so while I was annoyed slightly, like, whatever do you mean? I also got it, that it was her way of holding me accountable to something. And so what I want to say is that I do think it's hard, and I think that there's pressure on all sides. So I talk a lot in this book about how when I was growing up as a kid and I got, tagged as academically gifted, all of a sudden I was moved from classes with black kids to classes with white kids. And so black kids bullied me. So I didn't actually have any black friends really until I went to Howard. I mean, it's why I went to Howard. because I was just bullied and told that I was acting white for my whole childhood. But one of the things I've discovered in the process of talking about these books, talking about Beyond Respectability, my academic book, and Eloquent Rage, which is such a different book, is I think that one of the reasons that I've been so committed in my career to talking in both registers, to talking to home folks and talking to academic folks, is because it was the thing that dogged me throughout my childhood, that everybody said I sounded white, acted white, talked too proper, wanted to be white. And I'm like very happy that I figured out how to code switch properly at this point, because it was not inevitable that it was going to turn out that way. And so for me, it's a healing practice to have figured out how to be in community with my own folks and to not let all of the academic ascension rob me of the space of connection. And that has been an intentional commitment. And so, you know, my grandmother said things like that to me. Well, baby, you know, why you don't just go up here to the local college and get you a clerical degree? So what I will say is that she didn't always understand me. My folks, look, my auntie, this same auntie who was looking at me crazy, I love The Big Bang Theory. I know it's very white, but I love it anyway. Yeah, it's my show. And she watches that show and she loves it too. And she's like, you're like Sheldon, which is an insult. It's like, because Sheldon is terrible. And I feel like it's her way of saying, baby, you real smart. I don't get you, but you real smart though, right? And so what I would just say to you is that I get it on all sides. That most of the time when my folks see me doing my thing, they're just like, you look real pretty on TV, real pretty. We don't know what you were talking about, but you looked great. And so, yeah. So I think that we have to do our own healing around it, and maybe thinking about that maybe maybe that part of your grandmother's response was that she felt afraid. Yeah. She didn't know how to relate to you, and maybe she felt judged by you. Maybe. Even if she wasn't, even if that's not the mode in which you were moving, you got to remember that our folks have so much trauma, and what they want, the thing that I've learned and the thing that I say, I don't actually go home and do a lot of the like, let me tell you about all the things I know, and I'm not saying that you were doing that at all, but the thing, because the thing that I've come to learn and the thing that I always want my folks to know is that no matter how many books I read or how many books that I ever write, there are things that my mom has told me about how to deal with people. Yeah. That have made my life infinitely easier in institutions, and I could never learn it in a book. And there are things my grandmother taught me about, you know, how to trust my spirit, and how to trust when somebody ain't right. And when you know it's that thing, they be like, your spirit, right? You know, my spirit told me you wasn't right. But that's my grandmama and my mama all day. And look, and when I was getting my PhD, and they fucked with me at different parts of that process because of the hazing process, the thing that got me through it was I would just sometimes be like, but I am Luvinia's granddaughter, and I am Debbie's daughter, and I know what I am made of. And even if these folks can't see it, I'm very clear about who I am. And so when my friends who didn't always have that same level of self-possession were coming through institutions, it would crush them. And then they wonder why I can be okay. And it's like, because I know whose child I am. I know whose community I belong to. I know who raised me, and I know what they put in me. And mostly what they put in me was, baby, we don't care how smart they are. Don't take nobody's shit. You ain't got to take nobody's shit. You know? And so when I go home, that is the space I move in, is I try to remind these folks, you raised me. This is who I am. And when my mom and my aunties don't get me, then sometimes that's the thing I say back to them. You know, they'll be like, well, you know, all this, you ain't gonna never have nobody. Why you ranting on Facebook all the time about feminism, you know? And I just say to them, I am who you raised me to be. That is always my response back to them. This is who you raised me to be. And you raised me beyond who you got to be, right? And so that has helped my mama and my aunties to... Yeah, it has helped my mama and my aunties. So I would just say that to you, that I try to see what is the thing that maybe my presence means for them. What is the thing that they are afraid of? I think my grandmother was afraid for me. When she would say, baby, all them books gonna run you crazy, so much of that resonates with me more now. I'm like, you actually wasn't wrong. You weren't wrong. All this shit in these books might actually run me crazy. And trying to talk to people about it, if I'm not careful, if I don't have some balance, you might actually have, so that's it. Trying to see what is the thing that they are reacting to, and trying to think about how can we just model yes, this process has changed me, but I'm still who you raised me to be. And I have deep appreciation and gratitude for everything you put in me, because that has allowed me to go this far. And I think sometimes whenever I figured out how to move in that space, and I didn't have it when I first came home from college, sometimes in grad school I would feel real isolated, and I just figured out all these things exist in me and they all work and they're all tools and I can use them and pull them out at will. And what is more funny is now I move in academic spaces far more like my grandmother and my mother than I ever intended on, because I just don't give a fuck anymore. And I'm like, I thought that y'all were so much smarter than me, and now I see that that's a lie. And so now this performance that you've demanded of me around academic whatever, it's like I can talk to you about your Foucault and your Agamben and your whatever, and we could talk about it. Or I could talk to you about this sort of Black women's epistemology that saves my life every day. And I could move in it in an embodied way, and that's what I'm gonna do. But if you know, and when people really try me, I'll just be like, well, like today, I mean, a white man tried it and I was like, Google me. My books. I'm not doing this with you. And so that's all I'm saying. Just move in the space of all the things and don't apologize for it. Google work. That's what the Google machine is for, D. That's what it's for.
We have time for one more question. I'll come up front here.
Yes. Church. We take offerings too, by the way. I'm joking.
Well, Darnell's a preacher, so he probably got a...
So I'm reading your book, and I actually really appreciated the conversation or the back and forth, because I think it helped to, center like the individual, right? I think that's sort of what's being fought through here, right? And I'm part of a movement for revolution, and I know you might have some disagreements with that, from what I understood on chapter 3, but. Leaving that aside, here's, because, I'm part, organizing to overthrow the system, to drive out the Trump-Pence regime, and, and I am an advocate for revolution and communism, all that stuff. But my question for either of you or both of you is, a lot of what you reflected on, right, sort of the larger society and how that's impacted oneself and identity and the transformation of that, how do you see, like, the times are pretty intense right now, right? How do you see that either on yourself or even amongst the youth or amongst different generations or amongst, like, people of all different ages and strata, like, how do you see that transforming? Do you see that transforming? Do you see them having an impact? And then I do think, I think the question of morality, right, like the ethos and stuff like that, right? People, both ourselves modeling like a different way the world could be, but then also, the space that opens up when there is resistance, when there is people, fighting for freedom and things like that, right? It opens up some space for all sorts of people to change, like, really rapidly. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or comments off this. I was just curious.
Sure. I mean, look, I think we need a revolution. I hope you didn't walk away thinking I'm not committed to the revolution, but what I'm committed to is us being very clear that we don't get to mow down Black communities with our notion of revolution, which are because those notions are sometimes inconvenient. And so what I talk about in this book is that whenever anyone is like, we just need to burn down everything, sometimes it strikes me as the thinking of people who haven't worked their whole lives to build something. And so, yes, I think our system is fundamentally evil, rooted in settler colonialism. Capitalism eats folks alive. We need a different imagining of what we can be and who we can be. And that is what my actual politics are. But I'm not willing to leave grandmama behind and babies behind and let women get slaughtered. And very often when we start talking about revolution, we forget that when we haven't done some of the internal work, when we haven't thought through trauma, when we haven't even figured out the creating of, like, so some of the folks I write about academically, I write about these bougie Black women from the late 19th and early 20th century. They were bougie and elitist and well-educated, but they were elitist because, they were the few Black folks who had been educated at that time. But they built a whole social service infrastructure to take care of Black folks in the midst of massive government privation. And so I see them as revolutionaries because they were like, we'll build it ourselves. What do our people need? They need schools, they need hospitals, they need libraries, they need convalescent. What do they need? We will build it. And today we talk a lot about revolution, but and too often our concepts of revolution are rooted in tearing down and not in building. And so even in my teaching, one of the ways that shows up for me at an individual level is when I'm running graduate seminars, for instance, I don't actually teach my students that the only thing we're in a graduate seminar to do is to deconstruct books and figure out what's wrong and what didn't they accomplish. Because now that I've written books, that shit is hard as fuck. But also, because then when my students graduate and they don't know how to construct their own work, because all they can see is the flaws and the imperfections and the things that don't work. And you can't teach people how to build if all you give them is a sledgehammer. You can't build nothing with just a sledgehammer. You can tear down a bunch of shit. And so that's the thing that I'm trying to get at is building from the rubble the only way to build a new world? Because I have experienced devastation in my life. My mom, in the book I say, the thing that my mom says about my dad, she said, he and I could work the whole week trying to build something. And in a weekend, he could come home and tear it all down. And if my revolution uses the language of tearing down and burning down, and I'm talking to people who have only experienced tearing down and burning down and devastation, why would they see anything that I'm talking about as any kind of freedom project that they want to get on board with? So I'm asking us not to not have the revolution. Fuck it, let's have the revolution, because the way that Black people are living now is no way to live. But do we have to do it in a way that is all about destruction and tearing down? Or can we have some more interesting, creative concepts, some constructionist concepts about the world we want to build? Because I guarantee you that if you start talking to Black people like that, you won't beat us to the revolution. We'll beat everybody else. We will be first in line for that revolution, for sure.
I mean, where's my offering plate? But this is so right. I think, I want to call out Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's name, who talks about abolition as not about the absence of the thing that we know is bad, that we want to get rid of, but as an imagining of what should go in the place of the thing that we need to get rid of. And so often I walk in rooms with organizers and I say, what does a Black, loving, liberatory world looks like to you? And it's mostly silence. Only because we've learned to critique the things that we know are wrong, but we haven't given ourselves time to, in collectivity, dream the things that needs to go in its place. So when we're organizing, I'll say to folk who are abolitionists, who believe police should be abolished, and I do, if in the absence of the 911 call, for a person like me who grew up and watched a man put my mother's head on a stove door, kick her in her face with the boot, and say, I'm going to kill you. As organizers, if we are not prepared to intervene such that somebody like my mama can live in the absence of the police, which we know we need to get rid of, we ain't ready for the revolution. If in our communities, we have yet to put things in place so that folk are not sexually assaulted, so that grandmamas walking down the street are not getting their purses robbed from them, so that folk don't have what they need to feel safe, to feel cared for, to feel seen, then fuck, we are not ready for the revolution. So what I mean is that as we prepare to do the work of deconstruction, we're really good at that. We're really good at analyzing those things. We have not done the work of building up and dreaming together what needs to go in the place of the shit that does not need to be here. Secondly, I'll say this, that the radical work is not necessarily analyzing, I say this everywhere I go, whose feet are on our necks. The work is analyzing whose necks our feet are on, and where we are in the work is the first part. So I always say you can't build a world bringing the same negative energy and the tools from the old world into the new, and some of us carry that shit in it with us. How many of our freedom dreams are somebody's nightmare? So I'm interested in what Robin Kelly calls a radical, like this freedom dream that takes all of this into consideration. And I really am. So yeah, I'm down for the Revelation 2, and I call for it, and I'll talk about that in the book some, but I also know that we have to struggle together to figure out what our peoples need, particularly those who are existing on the edges of the margins, such that in the absence of the behemoth, that is all of the systems we just talked about, we don't have in place any other mechanisms to do them harm. And until we can develop those things together, we ought not, let's call for the revolution, but let's not destroy until we can figure out what we need to build. Or let's destroy and build at the same time.
Preach real good. Preach real good.